It should have been over. 4 Japanese carriers, pride of the Imperial Navy, had already been reduced to burning carcasses beneath the waves. Victory should have brought silence, but instead, it brought pursuit. Because sometimes, war doesn't end when the enemy is broken. Sometimes, it ends when the ghosts stop fleeing. And on the morning of June 6, 1942, a crippled Japanese cruiser bleeding oil into the vast Pacific would become the final exclamation point in the Battle of Midway and a symbol of Japan's unraveling naval supremacy. But how did one last desperate skirmish, fought not by mighty carriers, but limping survivors, come to define the cost of arrogance and the turning tide of the Pacific War? Let us return to that morning. A trail of black oil, a ship in agony, and above it the shadows of American dive bombers angling toward destiny. It was the 6th day of June, and while much of the world slept, the Pacific remained ablaze. The Battle of Midway had climaxed with extraordinary force. The Japanese carrier fleet, long believed to be invincible, had suffered an unthinkable rout. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all gone. But not all Japanese forces had been accounted for. In the confusion that followed the aerial slaughter, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and Task Force 16 under Admiral Raymond Spruance received troubling intelligence. Scattered Japanese cruisers and destroyers, possibly including a 5th carrier, were retreating westward. The Americans, cautious yet emboldened, decided to press their advantage. Unbeknownst to them, the 7th Cruiser Division of the Imperial Japanese Navy, including the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, had narrowly escaped the inferno at Midway. These ships, originally part of a plan to bombard the island under cover of darkness, had received a recall order at the 11th hour. The air battle had rendered the invasion hopeless, but fate had more in store. During the night of June 5th, tragedy struck from within. Navigating through darkness, fearing American submarines, the cruisers turned sharply to avoid a contact. What followed was chaos. Mogami, misjudging her position, rammed into Mikuma, twisting her bow and rupturing both hulls. From that moment forward, the ocean became their enemy. Mikuma, now bleeding oil and slowed to a crawl, became a floating target. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the cruiser division, ordered the fleet to split. The damaged ships would limp home under destroyer escort. The rest would vanish into the haze of the Pacific. But eyes were watching. The Americans had not only radar, they had intelligence. Signals, intercepts, and aerial scouts created a loose map of the crippled remnants. More importantly, Lieutenant Commander John Murphy aboard the USS Tambor, a lone submarine shadowing the damaged Japanese ships, sent critical dispatches that would change the course of this pursuit. But what truly sealed Mikuma's fate was not American brilliance, it was Japanese miscalculation. The collision, the misidentification, the oil leak, they all culminated in one irrefutable truth. Mikuma had become visible. In a war of shadows, that meant death. As dawn painted the sky on June 6th, Spruance ordered a new wave of reconnaissance. Catalina patrol planes from Midway spotted smoke on the horizon. It wasn't a carrier, but the burning carcass of a Japanese heavy cruiser. The Americans didn't hesitate. From the decks of USS Hornet and USS Enterprise, waves of aircraft rose into the skies, a symphony of retribution. Dive bombers, Wildcats, Vindicators. Some were veterans from the carrier battles the day before. All were hungry for closure. Meanwhile, aboard Mikuma, Captain Sakayama knew what was coming. He had seen the oily wake, felt the tension of every failing bulkhead. As his crew fought the fires caused by the earlier attack, a lookout screamed the words he dreaded. Aircraft, many. He looked up. Dark specks emerged from the sky, not clouds, but angels of death. At first, they appeared like distant birds circling the sun, but as the seconds passed, the sky broke open with shrieks and steel. From the east came dive bombers, the legendary Douglas SBD Dauntless, their wings slicing the wind as they curled into attack angles, so steep they seemed suicidal. To the men aboard Mikuma and Mogami, the sky was not just falling, it was about to explode. The first American attack of the day was reckless, almost sacrificial. A squadron of Marine Corps Vindicator bombers, led by Captain Marshall Tyler, dove straight into the heart of the Japanese formation. The flak was intense orange bursts of heat, and shrapnel tore the sky around them. Captain Robert Fleming, at the controls of his burning aircraft, made a final, deliberate dive into Mikuma's rear turret, a suicide strike of sorts, born from either heroism or the acceptance of death. The explosion gutted the aft section of the cruiser, igniting fires that roared into the starboard engine intake. Dozens were killed instantly, the engine room filled with flame and fumes. Mikuma slowed further, becoming more helpless with every passing minute. Even Mogami, though not the focus of the strike, suffered splinter damage. Her captain stared in disbelief not at the Americans, but at the unfolding horror of being hunted, helpless, in open water. Still, the worst had yet to come. By midday, waves of aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet closed in a combined strike force of over 50 dive bombers, escorted by 20 Wildcats. This was no probing run, this was the hammer. From the first wave, Ensign Don Adams of the Enterprise scored a hit on the destroyer Asashio, tearing open her deck and sending fire through the compartments. The rest of the formation fanned out, zeroing in on the larger prize Mikuma. At a height of over 15 feet, the dauntless squadrons began their terrifying dives. Like birds of prey, they plunged nearly vertical, bomb bays open, engines screaming, tracing lines of vengeance through the air. Mikuma tried to respond. Her anti-aircraft gunners opened fire with everything they had, but it was uncoordinated, desperate. Shells burst harmlessly in the sky. The ship's movement once her shield was gone. Bomb after bomb struck. Explosions lit the deck. One tore through the port side near the engine room, another hit the bridge. Captain Sakiyama was killed in the blast, his body flung from the command post. The heat melted steel. The pressure ruptured bulkheads. Below deck, the sickbay filled with wounded from the earlier attacks was engulfed in fire. The flames fed on oxygen, the walls glowed, the ceiling cracked. With no hope of rescue, Commander Sowatari, overseeing damage control, gave the unthinkable order, seal the compartment. And with that, dozens of wounded men, including medics, nurses, and doctors, were entombed alive. Meanwhile, Mogami continued to suffer. One bomb punctured her seaplane deck, triggering a chain of explosions that nearly tore off the rear turret. She managed to keep moving barely, but the damage was profound. 90 dead, over 100 wounded. Her decks were scorched, her torpedo tubes destroyed, her pride extinguished. But she still floated. Above, the scene was brutal, but not all pilots were immune to its weight. Lieutenant Cleo Dobson, a dive bomber pilot from Hornet, described the sight in his diary. As he approached the target, ready to release his payload, he saw something that stopped his hand. Hundreds of sailors, Japanese, in the water, some clutching debris, others waving in surrender or panic. The sea was littered with oil and fire, but also human desperation. He hesitated. And then he turned away, unable to deliver the killing blow. Not because the enemy didn't deserve it, but because in that moment between altitude and impact he saw not the rising sun, but men. Just men. Fighting, bleeding, drowning. It was a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the smoke grew so thick it became a second sky, Mikuma groaned beneath the weight of her wounds. She was no longer a warship. She was a graveyard afloat. With no remaining propulsion, no command structure, and fires spreading beyond control, the order was given. Abandon ship. Sailors poured into the water, some in life rafts, others clutching the hands of dying comrades. But even that was not the end. Another bomb exploded near the stern, fracturing the keel. The ship began to list. By sunset, Mikuma rolled onto her side, her mast dipping beneath the waves. Moments later, she was gone. 700 men died with her. Only a few dozen were pulled from the sea by the destroyers before they too were forced to retreat under threat of more American planes. The ocean swallowed her whole, and with her, one more fragment of Japan's shattered ambition. Night fell over the Pacific like a shroud, hiding the wreckage beneath its inky skin. But even in darkness, the truth could not be buried. The sinking of Mikuma was more than a tactical victory, it was a psychological reckoning. The American crews returned to their carriers shaken. They had witnessed not just the destruction of enemy warships, but the intimate chaos of men burned, drowning, and left behind. The thrill of triumph, for many, had been replaced by the heavy quiet of consequence. Mogami, though grievously wounded, managed to escape the slaughter. Her survival was not due to luck alone. In a decision that likely spared her from Mikuma's fate, her damage control officer had jettisoned all torpedoes, volatile warheads that, had they been hit, would have detonated the entire ship. It was a decision contested by her captain at the time, but that decision, though unpopular, saved hundreds of lives. After limping westward for days, she reached Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands, where she underwent 5 weeks of emergency repairs. The work would restore her seaworthiness, but not her soul. Mogami had survived, but she was no longer a predator. She was a reminder. A reminder of Midway, of loss, of error, of what happens when victory is assumed, not earned. By the time Task Force 16 turned eastward on June 7th, the damage had already been done not just to ships, but to Japan's naval doctrine itself. In total, Japan had suffered staggering losses in the Battle of Midway. 3,057 men dead. 4 fleet carriers lost: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. 1 heavy cruiser destroyed, Mikuma. A second cruiser, Mogami, crippled. 2 destroyers, Arashio and Asashio, heavily damaged. 248 aircraft destroyed, including many irreplaceable dive bombers and fighters. But the numbers didn't tell the full story. Japan lost far more than ships and planes. It lost its best pilots, its seasoned mechanics, and its irreplaceable deck crews. These men had trained for years in a system that produced elite naval aviators, but not in sufficient numbers. There was no pipeline to replace them. Even before Midway, the Battle of the Coral Sea had depleted Japanese air power. Zuikaku, one of Japan's most advanced carriers, was absent at Midway, not because of damage, but because it lacked trained air crews. After Midway, this gap became a chasm. Without the carriers, Japan lost the ability to project power across the Pacific. Without the pilots, it lost the ability to contest the skies. And without the truth, the acknowledgement of the scale of their defeat, they lost the opportunity to adapt. The United States had not emerged unscathed. USS Yorktown, a symbol of resilience, was mortally wounded and later sunk by submarine attack. The destroyer Hammond went down beside her. 307 American lives were lost. More than 150 aircraft were destroyed, many of them obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers that had proven ineffective and vulnerable. But unlike Japan, the United States had 2 advantages: resources and time. American industry would replace its losses in months. Its naval aviators, trained in a more scalable, flexible system, would return in greater numbers. And perhaps most crucially, American intelligence had turned the tide. By breaking Japan's JN-25 naval code, the U.S. Navy had learned in advance of the planned attack on Midway. It allowed Nimitz to set a trap and Spruance to spring it. Without that, the battle may have gone very differently. Midway wasn't just won in the skies. It was won in radio rooms and decoding stations. The destruction of Mikuma and the failure of the Midway operation shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. Only 6 months earlier, Japan had dominated the Pacific seizing territory, sinking ships, humiliating the Allies. Now, its elite strike force, the Kido Butai, lay in ruins. It was a turning point, not just in strategy, but in psychology. Japan would never again go on the offensive in the same way. The initiative now belonged to the United States, and with it, a new campaign of island hopping, blockades, and relentless pressure. Midway wasn't the end of the war. But it was the end of the beginning. And Mikuma, her twisted hull now resting on the ocean floor, became a symbol of that turning tide. Somewhere, deep beneath the Pacific, lies the wreck of Mikuma. She is not visited, she is not salvaged. She remains untouched, her bones cloaked in darkness, her name fading from memory. But perhaps, in that cold silence, she speaks louder than ever. Because empires are not just defeated in grand battles, they are broken in forgotten moments. A misstep, a miscommunication, a collision in the night. And when the war ends, it is not always the last battle that matters most, but the one no one saw coming. In the decades that followed, the story of Midway and the final moments of ships like Mikuma took on almost mythic proportions. Historians would later call it the most decisive naval engagement since Trafalgar. But unlike that 1,805 battle of wooden ships and cannon shot, Midway was fought with steel, fire, and the thin line between radio waves and silence. Japan, once convinced of its divine right to rule the Pacific, would spend the rest of the war in retreat. Its leaders buried the truth of Midway beneath propaganda, clinging to illusions of strength. But the wreckage couldn't lie, and the names of the fallen couldn't be erased. Sakayama, the captain who watched his cruiser bleed oil before the sky fell in. Takashima, the executive officer who gave the final order to abandon ship. Murphy, the American submarine commander who glimpsed fate through a periscope. Dobson, the dive bomber pilot who turned away when faced with the humanity of the enemy. And then, there were the unnamed, the engine room workers, the sick bay medics, the gunners who fired blindly into the sky. The sailors who clung to debris in the burning sea, hundreds of them swallowed by salt and flame. They are the silent narrators of this story. They are what remain when the headlines fade. If the Pacific has a memory, it lies in these stories not of generals and admirals, but of men who lived and died inside decisions far beyond their control. And if we are to learn anything from their sacrifice, it is this: that history is not just strategy and steel. It is fragility, chance, and the terrifying speed at which certainty collapses. This has been a Legacy Files documentary. If you felt the weight of the story, if it moved you to see beyond the headlines, consider subscribing for more long-form histories that dive beneath the surface. Because sometimes the past isn't past at all. Sometimes it's just waiting to be remembered.